Welcome everyone. On July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo in South Africa, a baby boy was born who would one day change his country forever. His name was Nelson Mandela, but the world would come to know him as Nelson Mandela. His story is one of the most powerful examples of courage, forgiveness, and determination in modern history. Young Rolihlahla grew up in the beautiful hills of the Transkei region. His father was a local chief, and the family lived a traditional life. When Rolihlahla was 7 years old, he became the first person in his family to attend school. On his first day, his teacher gave him an English name, as was the custom at that time. She called him Nelson. Nelson's childhood changed dramatically when his father died. He was only 9 years old. The acting regent of the Thembu people adopted Nelson and raised him in the royal household. There, Nelson learned about African history and the stories of his ancestors who fought against colonial rule. These stories planted the first seeds of his future struggle. As a young man, Nelson moved to Johannesburg in 1941. He was supposed to marry a woman chosen by his guardian, but he ran away instead. This was his first act of rebellion. In the big city, he worked as a security guard at a mine and later as a law clerk. He studied hard at night, determined to become a lawyer. In Johannesburg, Nelson saw the harsh reality of apartheid for the first time. Apartheid was a system that separated people by race. Black people could not live in certain areas, could not use the same facilities as white people, and had almost no political rights. Nelson watched his people suffer every day. He knew something had to change. In 1944, at the age of 26, Nelson joined the African National Congress, or ANC. This organization fought for the rights of black South Africans. Together with his friends Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Nelson formed the ANC Youth League. They wanted to take stronger action against apartheid. Nelson was no longer just studying law. He was becoming a freedom fighter. Nelson opened the first black law firm in South Africa with Oliver Tambo in 1952. They helped thousands of black people who faced injustice under apartheid laws. But Nelson knew that legal work alone was not enough. He organized peaceful protests, strikes, and demonstrations. The government watched him closely. In 1956, the government arrested Nelson along with 155 other activists. They were charged with treason, which means betraying the country. The trial lasted 5 years. Can you imagine? 5 years of uncertainty, of not knowing if you would be found guilty and executed. But in 1961, all the accused were found not guilty. Nelson was free, but not for long. The government became more violent. In 1960, police shot and killed 69 peaceful protesters in Sharpeville. Nelson realized that peaceful protest alone might not work anymore. He made a difficult decision. He helped form Umkhonto weSizwe, which means, Spear of the Nation. This was the armed wing of the ANC. They would use sabotage against government buildings, but they tried not to hurt people. Nelson traveled secretly to other African countries to get support and military training. When he returned to South Africa in 1962, the police arrested him. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But while he was already in prison, the police raided the ANC's secret headquarters. They found documents about the armed struggle. Nelson and 7 others were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The trial began in 1963. Nelson knew he might be sentenced to death. On April 20, 1964, he gave a speech from the dock that would become famous around the world. He spoke for over 4 hours. He explained why they had to fight against apartheid. He ended with these powerful words: "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew these might be his last words. On June 12, 1964, Nelson and 7 others were found guilty. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. Nelson was 46 years old. He did not know that he would spend the next 27 years behind bars. Nelson was sent to Robben Island, a prison on a small island off the coast of Cape Town. The conditions were terrible. He had to break rocks in a limestone quarry every day. The bright white stone damaged his eyes permanently. He slept on a thin mat on the floor of a tiny cell. He could write and receive only 1 letter every 6 months. He could have 1 visitor every 6 months for only 30 minutes. But Nelson did not break. He studied. He read. He exercised every morning. He organized other prisoners and turned the prison into a place of learning. The prisoners called it Mandela University. He taught younger activists about politics and strategy. He learned Afrikaans, the language of the prison guards and the apartheid government. He wanted to understand his enemy. The years passed slowly. Nelson missed his children growing up. His mother died in 1968, and his eldest son died in a car accident in 1969. The government refused to let him attend either funeral. Can you imagine that pain? Being locked away while your loved ones die, unable to say goodbye. His wife Winnie fought bravely outside, but the struggle took a toll on their marriage. Inside prison, Nelson never gave up hope. He always believed that one day South Africa would be free. He once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." These words kept him going through the darkest times. Other prisoners looked to him for strength. Even the guards began to respect him. Outside the prison walls, the world had not forgotten Nelson Mandela. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, people around the world demanded his release. "Free Nelson Mandela" became a global cry. Musicians wrote songs about him. Governments imposed sanctions on South Africa. The pressure on the apartheid government grew stronger every year. In 1982, after 18 years on Robben Island, Nelson was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. The conditions were slightly better, but he was still a prisoner. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered to release Nelson if he would renounce violence. Nelson refused. He sent a message through his daughter, "I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated." By the late 1980s, South Africa was in crisis. The economy was struggling because of international sanctions. Violence was increasing. The government realized that apartheid could not continue. In 1989, a new president, F.W. de Klerk, came to power. He understood that change was necessary. Secret talks began between the government and Nelson Mandela. On February 11, 1990, the world watched in amazement. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison a free man. He was 71 years old. He had spent 27 years in prison, almost a third of his life. Television cameras from around the world captured the moment. Nelson raised his fist in the air, the symbol of the freedom struggle. Thousands of people gathered to see him. But Nelson's work was far from over. Now came perhaps his greatest challenge, preventing a civil war. Many black South Africans wanted revenge for decades of oppression. Many white South Africans feared what would happen under black majority rule. Nelson had to unite a divided nation. He had to convince people to forgive, not to seek revenge. Nelson led negotiations with the government to end apartheid peacefully. It was not easy. Violence continued. In 1993, Chris Hani, a popular ANC leader, was assassinated. The country stood on the edge of chaos. Nelson went on television and calmed the nation. He showed the leadership South Africa desperately needed. For their work in ending apartheid peacefully, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. It was a remarkable moment. The prisoner and his jailer's president, standing together, recognized for choosing peace over war. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election where people of all races could vote. Millions of black South Africans voted for the first time in their lives. Some people stood in line for hours, some for days. Many were elderly, some were sick, but they were determined to vote. It was a moment of incredible joy and pride. The ANC won the election with 62% of the vote. On May 10, 1994, at the age of 75, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. The ceremony took place in Pretoria, attended by the largest gathering of world leaders ever seen in Africa. Nelson stood before the world and said, "Never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." As president, Nelson faced enormous challenges. South Africa had deep wounds from decades of apartheid. There was poverty, inequality, and trauma. Nelson established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This commission allowed victims of apartheid to tell their stories and allowed perpetrators to confess their crimes. It was based on the principle of forgiveness, not revenge. Nelson understood the power of symbols. In 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had been seen as a white person's sport, a symbol of apartheid. But Nelson wore the green and gold Springbok jersey and cheered for the South African team. When South Africa won, it was a moment of unity. Black and white South Africans celebrated together. It was a small step, but an important one. Nelson served only one term as president. He stepped down in 1999, at the age of 81. He could have stayed in power longer, but he believed in democracy. He wanted to set an example of peaceful transition of power. After leaving office, he continued to work on issues like HIV, AIDS, education, and peace. In his later years, Nelson became a global symbol of peace and reconciliation. He established the Nelson Mandela Foundation to continue his work. He spoke out against injustice wherever he saw it. He criticized powerful leaders when they made mistakes. He never lost his moral courage. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, surrounded by his family. The world mourned. Memorial services were held across the globe. World leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people paid tribute to this extraordinary man. In South Africa, people gathered in the streets to sing, dance, and celebrate his life. So what can we learn from Nelson Mandela's journey? First, we learn about patience and perseverance. 27 years in prison did not break his spirit. He never gave up on his dream of a free South Africa. When we face difficulties in our own lives, we can remember Mandela's patience. Second, we learn about the power of forgiveness. After 27 years of unjust imprisonment, Nelson could have sought revenge. Instead, he chose reconciliation. He invited his former jailer to his presidential inauguration. He had tea with the widow of the architect of apartheid. He showed that forgiveness is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Third, we learn about sacrifice. Nelson gave up his freedom, his family life, and his youth for a cause greater than himself. He believed in something so strongly that he was willing to die for it. His sacrifice reminds us that real change often requires personal cost. Fourth, we learn about the importance of education. Even in prison, Nelson never stopped learning. He studied, he read, he taught others. He believed that education was the most powerful weapon for changing the world. No matter our circumstances, we can always learn and grow. Fifth, we learn about leadership. Nelson led by example. He did not ask others to do what he was not willing to do himself. He listened to others, even his opponents. He built bridges instead of walls. He united people instead of dividing them. In our own lives, whether we lead a country or a small team, we can follow his example. Finally, we learn that one person can change the world. Nelson Mandela was born in a small village with no electricity or running water. He faced a system that told him he was inferior because of his skin color. But he refused to accept injustice. He fought, he sacrificed, and he never gave up. And he changed his country and inspired the world. Nelson Mandela's life shows us that the human spirit is stronger than any prison, any system of oppression, any obstacle. His story teaches us that with courage, determination, and forgiveness, we can overcome even the greatest challenges. His legacy lives on in South Africa and around the world, inspiring new generations to fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. As Nelson himself said, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. His life made an enormous difference. And each of us, in our own way, can make a difference too.